So we're going to talk about the last portion of Who Moved My Cheese in a Book Club. So in the final chapter, what jumped out to me, we usually talk about what stood out from the section. If you could implement one idea from it, what would it be? And did I disagree? I didn't actually answer any of those questions. I had one excerpt in that last small section that jumped out at me. Sometimes we're not even aware that we're afraid. I think, the fear part of change is a big impact, but that was just the big thing that jumped out at me. Neil and Eric, how about you both? What were your overall impressions of the last section, or Eric on the overall thing? Since you were going to make it last time.
Mine was there was a specific, I'm going to try to find that reference. There's a quote I really liked, but the focus on not being him, right? Just all those little things. It's interesting. And then at the end, there's a second version of this book coming 20 years later. So I was going to purchase that. But I'm like, what happened to him? Because you got to know, right? Because he's just like left in the maze. Probably.
Yeah, I put that on my wish. I put that on my reading list too. Good point. I didn't realize there was a
that's scary.
In the story is like a deliberate cliffhanger, like literally ellipsis ... and then they just leave you wondering sort of what happened. So yeah, I think that the story that stuck out from the discussion later the same day was the I forget if it was Nathan or what the character's name was, but the one that had the sort of big box store came in, like Dick's Sporting Goods sort of thing, and displaced them, and they were just almost deliberately closed off to seeing the change in the market and the customer behavior and the threat posed. And by the time they realized and their revenue was impacted, it was kind of like, it sounded like it was too late for them to course correct. And so he was already kind of resigned, moving on to like the next business opportunity. I don't know if it was the next job or the next business he was going to start where he was in that organization. But so there was that sort of tinge of like regret of, acting too late and really like nothing you could do about it now, but still being like, hey, new cheese is out there, that was interesting to take it that far down the timeline, because usually these stories are kind of like the business leader is the hero, making the course correction, saving the day with that brilliant insight. And this was sort of almost kind of like a cautionary tale, but still hopeful and looking ahead.
Think about this and a rapid action that we did in engineering this week on responding to some performance issues. It was interesting, unmoving of cheese of need to select one engineer across my teams was best equipped to help with this, had the skills, but also basing on how many people are on each team, who's out currently, which product manager is the primary product manager for that team, their thoughts on this, et cetera. And it was an interesting set of discussions to try to make that the best decision. There was no perfect decision. It was making the best decision. And cheese moving around. It's interesting is the people leaders got more stressed over this change than actually the engineers that were involved. The engineers, oh, yep, I can help with this, or no, I don't know a lot about that. But overall it went well. Part of it is that, it was one of the quotes is a change imposed is a change opposed. Like one, and this is on my peer and I, we left one product manager out of the discussion. Like we didn't explicitly call them in, and we should have. And the decision was made relatively quickly. So we brought them in, like the decision was made, discussed and made yesterday. And one of the product managers impacted wasn't told until today. And they weren't part of the discussion. And I'm like, thinking doing the homer dough. It would have been better to do that. And my peer and product manager, yep, we apologized to that person, said, yep, we moved quickly, but we should have done that. Here are some ideas to lower the impact. And we now started discussing it. So it's all okay. Like giving people a chance to think about it before the decision is made when cheese is moving, and always explaining the why, but giving them that chance to comment on it before it's finalized is always helpful. Just very timely to today. So that just thinking about that just jumps out at me.
That thing you mentioned of like the people managers were more sensitive than the actual engineers ultimately is interesting, and that happens a lot. That was kind of one of my first pieces of feedback and insight in areas where I had to calibrate myself early when I started at GitLab, that, you know, doing a reorg, kind of keeping it a little bit too secret for too long. And I was missing the opportunity to just do what Yob, our product lead at the time, and Sid, is to just, hey, ask your people to be up for change. And they'll surprise you with how well they consume it and go along with it, as long as they're part of the project, as long as they see this as like, well, change is a sign of success at a growing startup and whatnot. And I think I was the manager in that case, trying to like, no, the comms plan has to be perfect, you know. But part of transparency is like immediacy, and anything that's not transparent for too long is not transparent enough. Even if reorgs are kept sort of in a closed room for some period of time, there's pressure to keep that as short as possible, or in your example, to bring in the right people into that room, so they're included and they can participate. But it also, like that, the manager being more sensitive to than the IC is an interesting thing, because one of the interesting things about the story to me was that, you know, you had the mice and the little people, right? And the mice like cheese, and it was a very straightforward like cheese with a lowercase c. And then they spent a little bit of time, but not a lot of time, talking about, well, the little people, it was cheese with a capital C, which was more all some form of like happiness. So like their cheese was more meta. And it's like, in this case, you know, the cheese for the engineer is maybe something maybe the domain that they're working on, or the particular MRs that they have in flight or something like that. So in this case, it really wasn't a big deal, it sounds like, for that person to kind of leave those things behind. You obviously close them out and then move on to the next one being in a different domain temporarily, and then presumably coming back later. The cheese for the manager, in some way, shape, or form, was almost the consistency they provide to their individuals. And so the manager's cheese was moved more than the IC in this case. And there's other cases, because like at my level, as I was reading the story, I was thinking, and some of the anecdotes of this chapter, I was thinking, gosh, for me at this point in my career and this point in my tenure in GitLab, change is almost my cheese. And so, you know what I mean? Like change itself. And if change isn't happening, then I feel like, you know, why aren't we adapting fast enough? You know, and so it's almost like this form of meta cheese or something like that. But then it's obviously it's different than other people's cheese, and it can create these sort of impedance mismatches of, well, what if we're changing too frequently or something like that. So listening to all the stories and thinking about what is the person's cheese here is surprisingly broad and dynamic and different kind of person to person.
Makes sense. Anything resonate with you, Neil? I know you've been through at least one restructuring, maybe more than one. Anything, if you look back on at least one of the more recent ones, like that, oh, hey, I could have done this. I wish I would have thought about this differently or that differently. And if you don't have anything that jumps out at you, that's fine too. But anything, anything you would do differently from the past?
Similar to what Eric said, and I think this has happened twice, and I forget what the other instance was, but the speed at which we were sharing this knowledge was way too slow for my comfort level. And the quicker I can get this information in my team's hands to be informed and help make decisions, the better. So yeah, I could definitely, because yeah, it was just a difficult subject to be in, or a situation to be in, for sure. I think we're getting better about how we do reorgs. I think the most recent one with the product alignment, that came up really fast. It just kind of happened. I know I was way ancillary to those changes, but you know, having that issue to track, to understand and follow along was great. So I think we're getting a lot better at that. But like was said, it's still that manager is so cognizant to the impact of these changes, where maybe it's not such a big deal. And the more quickly we can just perform and get this news out, the better for everybody. I like that a lot.
We're getting better at executing these things, because I also think we paid off some debt and had to do a bunch of these in a relatively short time frame, like the last 6 months. And I say we accrued some organizational debt there is because in 2018 and 2019 we're growing so fast. When you're growing 100, 130% per year, it can cover up little strategic foibles or missteps or teams being oversized or undersized, because everybody's growing. You have this sort of embarrassment of riches and headcount. Then the moment things kind of slowed down, the pandemic and economic impact and being more conservative and being conscious of R&D as a percent of revenue, all of a sudden we had to make trade-offs for the first time. And it was like, oh, well, obviously this is more important than that. We need to shift people there. And it was almost like 2 years worth of roadmap adaptations we probably should have been making, but didn't have the pressure to because of all the hiring we were doing. All of a sudden we had to make them. And so it feels like going forward, like I don't want to say that was the last one we'll do for a while, but it feels like from this point going forward, it'll be more like normal, the frequency, like, and it'll be clear to people of like, oh, well, this thing didn't hit its SMAO target or something like that. So we're going to reduce our investment by half and move it over here. And those will happen in a more reasonable time frame. But it sounds like we know how to do that more effectively, having gone through that kind of burst of quick changes we had to adapt to.
Definitely. So something else that resonated with me, and this was called out in this discussion, but a lot of the focus and resonated strongly with me was on career development, salary maybe, where some other people were mentioning, and there was the notion of sharing this with your kids. And Darva mentioned this last week, but she had her 13-year-old son read it, and they've already had great discussions. I'm really looking forward to see what comes out of that. I had this on my ottoman. It's a stupid title, right? Who Moved My Cheese? You're like, what is that? So my wife and my boys were, and they're 15 and 14 years old. They're like, what is this book? What is the silly book on that you're reading? And as I try to explain it to them, they actually were quite intrigued. So I'm really curious. My sons are going through early years of high school. The pandemic's not helping. They're getting their driver's license and permit in the coming 2 months, which is freaking scary. So I'm really curious to see how they approach this story in terms of where their life is at in their moment.
Yeah, my girls are 1, 4, and 6. So I'm really fingers crossed for Elon and the self-driving cars. He's got 10 years to figure it out, and then my kids will never have to actually. That's what I'm hoping for. But yeah, I mean, think of us being older, more established, working at GitLab, already being remote. Like I personally felt it's almost crazy how little I was affected by the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
But kids, particularly in that high school age, not only that sense of loss that they must feel, but like formative experiences that need to happen at specific times they're not necessarily getting. So I've been thinking a lot about the impact of the societal impact of people in that age range and what they're missing out on, what the long-term effects of that may or may not be, and what, if anything, we can do to kind of complement it or supplement what they're missing.
They're pretty innovative. My sophomore in high school is super innovative in terms of adapting. He jumped right in. He understood how to perform, how to be efficient with online learning, and then he's been able to supplement, building his relationship with friends, throughout. The other one didn't have those. He switched schools, right? It was a feeder high school with like 3 or 4 schools coming into it. He lost a couple of really good friends that went to another high school. And so, yeah, he's having a much more difficult time adapting. And that's the cheese for him is how do you build new friends? How do you get that built up?
So it sounds like that would have been an inflection point in his life anyway, switching schools, and then having to do that remotely just made it that much more difficult.
Yeah, because face-to-face it was 1 day, now it's 2 days a week, but it's with half of the class, half of his class. It originally was only a quarter. So yeah, there's not a lot of FaceTime with people, and you're not going to put that forward when it's all remote. They just want to get in and out of these online sessions as soon as possible. Unlike GitLab, right? We love these sync sessions as long as they're effective. With them, they're like, no, I want to hear what the teacher wants. What's my assignment? And I'm out. They don't have any of that note passing, chit chat opportunity that would normally exist.
The water cooler type conversations or the lunch table type conversations. Yeah.
Fun story. My older son, on the other hand, I came into his room one time and he had his classroom up and he has all of his Google Meets. Kids were up on the screen and his teacher. He also had his phone and he was FaceTiming with one of his friends. So he was essentially having like a note passing conversation with a friend in that same class while the larger class was taking place. So he found a technological way to supplement that experience. So he's able to find that cheese a little more elegantly, I think, or quicker, because he's utilizing technology and he already has that relationship.
Generation can adapt quicker. That makes me feel good. I think they'll have an easier time, 10, 20 years from now, being a remote worker, being a remote leader, it'll feel just so natural to them, hopefully, versus all of us had to go through some adjustment, I think.
Mhm.
Well, the one aspect, thanks for sharing, by the way, Neil.
Yeah, sure.
It's neat how your sons are adapting. The kind of like the personal career anecdote that I thought of that I haven't thought in a while about as I was reading the stories in this chapter was um, when I moved from my first company. So I've been at GitLab's my fifth startup. When I moved from my first to my second company, in retrospect, I joined a startup that was about 6 years into what turned out to be in what is classically like 8 years of runway. Like VCs invest in you, you have like kind of 6 to 8 years to figure things out. And that company ended up not really being able to make it. It was essentially sold for parts. So, we were bought by the 600-pound gorilla in the industry. They wanted the brand, they wanted the sales force, service the software until they can end of life it, let everybody else go. And I was one of those people sort of let go, given a cardboard box. And this was literally in 2008. And so the economy was still roaring. Luckily, I was at a company that was so close to kind of running out of steam. It happened early in what ended up being like a macroeconomic collapse where the whole world fell apart. So 2008, early in that year, I'm given a cardboard box. But things looked great. So I was actually, it's insane in retrospect. I was actually like stretching out. I was slow walking, interviewing for other companies and stuff like that, which is nuts. Cause like what happened with 6 months later, I would have been begging for any kind of job or something like that. But I was like delaying start dates and offers and stuff like that. But one of the things I did after that experience was, reading the financial blogs and stuff is like they said, start an emergency fund. So when I got my next job, the first 6 months, I just saved a ton of money, spent nothing. And I built up that emergency fund. So I knew if that ever happened again, I would have 6 months of mortgage expenses, whatever, car payments, and I'd never have to worry about that. And I really noticed the sort of like the way I carried myself at that next job, and ended up being a great home because I was there, ended up being there for 6 years. That company was growing as the bottom fell out of the economy. So I felt like I was in a rocket ship while the world was collapsing around me. We ended up IPOing years later, and that was all good stuff. But it changed my ability to kind of like take chances. And because I was never worried about like, well, what if I get fired? Because I knew I wouldn't be stressed. I wouldn't have to take money out in the credit cards or anything like that. And so I've given that advice to kind of everybody I've had the opportunity to give it to later. That really helped me personally. And then I was lucky to figure that out kind of early in my career. But when I was reading this story and people were talking about like specifically the job changes and things like that, that kind of helped me feel a little bit more like a ha than a hem in that circumstance. But I think it easily could have gone sort of the other way, where I was more upset or angry. And I think that having that base, that safety net, helped me kind of like do the sniffing thing more, like, be honest about self-assessment, like how's the company going, how's my performance going, and whatnot, just because I felt like no matter what happened, I'd have enough time to kind of figure it out, even if things got really, really sort of rough.
Yeah, I think that kind of safety net is great, and also keeping skills up to date, I think is something I've always tried to do. And is even if and doing the sniff test on the technologies that you're using, is this thing going away over time? Is it becoming lower in popularity? My career started as a C developer, and there's still code written in C. A lot of the Linux kernel is written in C, but most organizations aren't doing primary development in C. But when I was first learning it and first using it in my career, it was definitely very, very much needed. But then, seeing how other things were coming and keep making sure skills are updated. The world used to be run on relational databases, and now they still are, but now there's a lot of NoSQL databases, big data stores, and more and more of that. And knowing what's out there and seeing where things are going, I think is key. It's really easy to just look at what you know and assume that's going to be good for a really long time, but often over time it slowly degrades. The cheese gets smelly.
Yeah, I mean that's the same company I mentioned that I went to. I was there 6 years. In the latter 3 years, I met my now wife. This was it was a Boston-based company where I lived from at the time. an on-premise sort of culture. But I met my wife, and I was sort of trying to figure out, I hit 4 years, we went public, like, is it time for me to go do another startup or something like that? But I wanted to pursue that relationship, and we were long distance. She was in Tallahassee. She had a teach abroad opportunity in London, and then a gap year in her PhD, which was going to take her to New Orleans for a year of all places. So I decided to kind of stay on board in that company, kind of focus on pursuing that personal relationship, but have the job, have the continuity that came with that company. So I ended up going to London for a summer, getting engaged, moving to New Orleans. Then her internship to finish up her degree took us to DC. And then ultimately we decided to come out to San Francisco. So I had to kind of, like, I was at the point where, I was a senior director at this company. I had multiple teams I was working with, responsibilities I had sort of accrued over time. And it was really hard, but I had to kind of like give those things up. But it ended up being one of the best things I ever did, because I did kind of exactly what you said. Like, I started programming again, and this was like 2012. So I picked up Node, so I hadn't been like an everyday programmer for a while. And I was responsible for this little, like an event website that I decided to build in JavaScript and just code every day. And I learned, like, oh gosh, NPM, like, this is what a package manager should be, and stuff like that. And like, wow, the JavaScript ecosystem is moving 10 times faster than any other language ecosystem that I've seen. And oh my gosh, isometric JavaScript, like front end and back end, it could be the same language. Like, I learned all these insights and stuff like that from doing that. And so, but it was really hard to give up. Like, I was running localization at the time. And I just gave up that department, gave it to someone else, because in part it was like, well, Eric's going remote, he can't do as much anymore, It was like, and I wanted to hold on to that opportunity because it was so valuable to me personally. But in retrospect, I ended up making the best of it by refreshing my skills and learning a bunch of new stuff. And it's maybe more deliberate about creating those opportunities for myself kind of since then, because it really was accidental that I got to do that.
Awesome. Any parting comments from anybody, as we're almost out of scheduled time?
So there was some recommendations, like, this works better if everyone in the company is familiar with the story. They can associate themselves with one of the 4 main members. Wondering how we might roll that out. What are next steps?
Yeah, I promoted this in a good couple places, and definitely appreciate Eric joining in as well and promoting it. Didn't get a large number of people. Couple volunteers. Maybe a total of 10 people who attended today or the last one, or asynchronously. But other than that, not a lot of and not only in engineering. There was there's 1 or 2 people outside of engineering who participated, which was great. But other than that, not a lot of interest, at least not yet.
And that's also in the form of a book club, though, right? Not just the story, the underlying message. I'm also curious. This book is promoted as, like, I shared the story with them, and to me, the only way that's effective, because the preface and the section at the end where they're talking, the discussion, brings it all together. But the way it's portrayed is like you just share the story with them. How did you react to that statement? Is there like just the story somewhere? I know this was just over like a reunion chat. They were at dinner or something, and the guy just told them the story. But this whole book like wraps that much better than just somebody trying to tell a story. So that would be my other question, is like, rather than just, hey, you should read this book, because that just feels a little forced. How can we
maybe there's a
little bit softer
LinkedIn Learning or similar training class on processing and thriving in change, if we could encourage in a future OKR for people to take it. That might be too much, but
right.
Well, here's my thoughts, because we just happen to have a similar discussion at eGroup. So like, we do these quarterly offsites, and typically read a book and discuss is one of the standing agenda items, and it never quite takes. And McBee this time around said, hey, who actually read the book? And it was some mix of like, a lot of people, I read some of it and I bailed and read a summary. Some people didn't get to it at all, and stuff like that. And I think a lot of us are in the same mind of like, most business books could be an essay or a blog article rather than a whole book. But because of the economics of the publishing industry, you kind of have to make everything a book. And so clearly this is something where there's this interesting story or anecdote, and they pad it into a 90-page thing so they can sell it for $11 or whatever, $15 soft cover. But I think you get more participation when something is short and very focused. And so I think what I would do next time is like, maybe there's a way we could buy in bulk or some kind of like a site license of like just the story and just PDF it and make it available for everybody free, like keep the bar really low to just get this thing. And then promote it in such a way where it's like, hey, you know, we're going to read an essay. It's really lightweight. Then we're going to do mostly discussion about this and try to make it relevant to work. It's about managing change in your personal and professional life. Maybe give an example or something like that, just to kind of tie it to like what's important to specific people and how is it relevant to like what we're doing today, like mentioning reorgs that we've just done, kind of as you did, but just kind of like lowering the bar as much as possible and tying it to kind of what people are experiencing in the immediate sense are probably the two ways to get more participation on something like this.
Glad you brought it up, Neil. It's a great question. All right. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Neil.
Definitely. You too.
Good to catch up, guys.
Okay.
See ya.